Your Excellencies, ladies and gentlemen, welcome to the Banyan Tree Leadership Forum at CSIS. Thank you for joining us for this important presentation today. My name is Ernie Bauer. I'm the Senior Advisor and Director of the Southeast Asia Program here, as well as our brand new Pacific Partners Initiative. I lead that program with my colleague, Dr. Mike Green, and it's the first program at a major Washington, D.C. think tank focused exclusively on Australia, New Zealand, and the Pacific Island countries. We're honored to have on hand one of the people who inspired us to initiate that new program here as our honored speaker today, Assistant Secretary of State for East Asia and the Pacific, Kurt Campbell. Kurt, thanks for joining us. We're lucky to have Kurt with us today. He's leaving for Auckland, New Zealand, to help lead the largest ever United States delegation to the Pacific Islands Forum, and I hope, as a fellow rugby player and avid fan, that he's got a ticket for the All Blacks Tonga game that kicks off the 2011 Rugby World Cup in Auckland this Friday. Kurt has been a leader, as you know, of U.S. policy in Southeast Asia and Asia, in the Asia-Pacific generally during his tenure at the State Department. His strategic thinking, coupled with his intense commitment and high energy, have combined to deliver impressive results. His leadership on a proactive and engaged U.S. foreign policy is well known both here in the United States, and certainly across Asia. And I think you'll agree that Kurt's actions speak louder than any words I could use to introduce him today. So without further ado, I'd like you to join me in welcoming our guest speaker today, the Honorable Kurt Campbell.
Thank you very much, Ernie, and it's great to see so many friends in the audience, and very grateful to be back at CSIS. I want to say how pleased we are that this program is underway. The work that Ernie, that John Hamry, that Mike Green and others have done to advance not only our thinking and understanding of the developments in Asia, but particularly the work on Southeast Asia and now on the Pacific and Australia and New Zealand, I think helps complement the concept of a totality in terms of our comprehensive approach to the Asian Pacific region, in which countries like India, even in Latin America, are playing a larger role in this dynamic region. Today, I'm here to talk to you about the Pacific. And one of the things that you find when you talk about the Asia Pacific, many friends in the Pacific will tell you that in that shorthand, it is the second word that gets short shrift. That there is enormous focus on Asia, but not enough focus on the Pacific. And one of the things that we have tried to do over the course of the last few years is do a comprehensive assessment, almost an accounting of where we stand in the Asian Pacific region, in the Pacific, and think about what we need to do in terms of going forward. I had the great good fortune this summer of traveling on a multi-agency trip throughout the Pacific, in which we hit 10 islands in about a week and a half, led by Admiral Walsh, our very able SINCPAC fleet, but also with friends from USAID and the Department of Defense as well. I think it would be fair to say that what we have found over the course of the last couple of years is a twofold set of truths. One is that the United States continues to have enduring strategic, political, moral interests in the Pacific. They date back to before the Second World War, and they will continue and they endure. I think the second thing that at least I have discovered personally is a general disappointment with the lack of performance on the part of the United States and indeed other countries in terms of implementing our overall game plan in the Pacific, and a deep recognition that we need to do better, and we need to better work together in terms of ensuring greater coordination on a variety of issues, but also reflect more honestly about what some of the nature of the challenges are that we are facing in the Pacific as a whole. So what I thought I would do is give you kind of our overall assessment of what we find as we look at the Pacific, and then try to give you a glimpse of what our strategy is going forward, what we want to achieve, what we think some of the inhibitions are of success, some of the challenges that we face, and sort of an overall recognition of some of the limitations, both in terms of resources and also, obviously, an extraordinarily full foreign policy, national security agenda. So I think we began, if you look over the course of the last 20 years, a fairly dramatic scene setter, a reduction in U.S. assistance, cutting back on our diplomatic outposts in the Pacific, a consolidation around a couple of key islands, challenges in terms of democracy and the stability of governments in the Pacific. If you look at the Pacific, many respects the hinge, the overall transportation, economic links basically are built around Fiji. With the developments in Fiji has made it very difficult to do the kind of consequential coordination that we would like to see. I think we've also seen a lack of coordination among some of the key countries who have interests in the Pacific. Clearly, the Pacific is in the backyard of Australia and New Zealand. I think it would be fair to say until recently we had not done enough coordination with our allies and friends, and we had not done enough to support them in their important endeavors in the Pacific. But it does not end there. Obviously, Japan, China, Taiwan, the EU, the international financial institutions, the multilateral development banks, all have extraordinarily developed programs in the Pacific. And in fact, if you look at the Pacific and its challenges, enormous poverty, extraordinarily acute health challenges, a number of problems associated with the environment. If you think about climate change, the Pacific really is the canary in the coal mine. If you travel to the Pacific, particularly low-lying atolls, it is immediately recognizable, some of the effects on their lives and livelihoods. One of the things that we have seen generally is that compared to other very challenged places around the globe, the Pacific actually has a remarkably high level of assistance that is coming in, either directly from the United States government. Some of our monies go through a different mechanism, what are called our compacts with countries that we have enduring security and political relations, given our relationship in Kwajalein and Micronesia and the like, but also from all these various different countries, all of which have bilateral interests in the Pacific as a whole. So we see an environment of just enormous challenges, spanning every aspect of life. Energy costs are higher in the Pacific than almost any place on the planet. At the same time, remarkably little systematic use of recyclable and other energy technologies. Health problems which are acute, which have led many islanders to leave their homes to seek treatment elsewhere. A set of challenges associated with brain drain that are immediately recognizable from any country in Africa or throughout the third world. And so as we scan that environment, one of the things that was also clear on this most recent trip is that if you go to any of the Capitol buildings, more recent structures, you will see black and white pictures of earlier periods of American and other engagement in which we had remarkably more resources to bring to bear. But at the same time, it is possible to glimpse, shall we say, the legacy, sometimes rotting in harbors. Over a period of 30 or 40 years, there have been several efforts to try to bring new patrol boats, for instance, to the Pacific. This is the largest oceanic domain on the planet, millions of miles, some of the most important areas with regard to fisheries. Some of these fisheries are still relatively pristine. They're at risk. They're at risk of being overfished due to large trawlers coming in illegally into coastal waters. We have seen a variety of major projects that frankly over the course of the last 30, 40 years have failed for a variety of reasons. And so when we took stock, we tried to think carefully about how you use scarce resources. How can you be effective given the nature of the challenges that we're facing, and how can we build on our strengths? By an order of magnitude, we are still the most important security player in the Asian Pacific region in terms of our Navy and our Air Force, and also the role of our Coast Guard that plays a remarkably and innovative role in the Pacific as a whole. So our overall game plan is along these lines. First, we sought to really learn from the past, to look carefully at what we had done in the past, see where it had been effective, but also recognize that there have been many failed attempts, both in terms of improving health indicators, but also in terms of, for instance, maritime domain awareness and the ability for these very small island nations to patrol vast areas of water. So how to think constructively about, again, limited resources, enormous challenges. I think the first thing that we recognized was a need for a substantial institutional re-engagement across a range of both bilateral and multilateral arenas. The first was a decision that Raj Shah and Secretary Clinton made to reintroduce USAID back to the Pacific. Now you could say, well, that's a modest thing, but it's enormously important to our friends in the Pacific. And it is important all the more so given the fact that we are under enormous budget challenges. The fact that with the support of key players on Capitol Hill, there has been a consequential decision to go back to the Pacific and to focus carefully on a range of issues, focused on a couple of key areas: climate change, the role of women and girls, and of course some enduring problems on the health agenda going forward. And so we're proud of that. It's a modest first step, but again, within the larger backdrop of substantial cuts. I hope friends understand the important nature of this. And what we have found is how many countries, particularly Australia, New Zealand, and other friends in Asia, have said how much they want to coordinate and cooperate with us. And so our goal is to work with other nations, other like-minded and other countries, to ensure that our assistance is better coordinated going forward. So that's the first part of what we might call institutional re-engagement. The second is that the Pacific also has a range of institutions, the most important of which is called the Pacific Island Forum. One of the things I did not mention at the outset is that what's also immediately available to anyone who spends time in the Pacific is the enormous differences across these islands, different cultures, languages, different approaches. And so they resist and frankly somewhat resent the sense that they are thought of as just being all alike as Pacific Island nations. And so we've sought, as we engage in institutions like the Pacific Island Forum, to work not only as part of a larger group, but also have important bilateral interactions, particularly with the key island nations. As Ernie was gracious enough to indicate, actually as I leave this afternoon, I'll be going as part of Deputy Secretary Nides' largest delegation ever on the part of the United States to the Pacific Island Forum. We'll send about 40 people there from almost every important agency: the State Department, the Coast Guard, the Department of Defense, U.S. Forces, USAID, Interior Department, the White House, virtually every agency inside the U.S. government that has a role in how to think about the Pacific will be sending senior representatives, and we will all be under Deputy Secretary Nides' leadership. And I look forward to helping represent the United States as part of this very substantial delegation. I just want to underscore here what the contrast is. 6 years ago, during the Pacific Island Forum, we had 2 people there. All right? And so this is really a determination to suggest that we want to bring more resources to bear, but more importantly, we want to coordinate inside our government. The other issue that we found as we went through the Pacific is that we discovered programs and other initiatives that we had no idea were underway, right? And so when we talk about the Pacific as a whole, we think one of the most important things that could be done is a greater degree of what we might call donor or assistance coordination. When we think about that, our first way of thinking about it is along the lines of making sure that countries like China and Taiwan and Japan and France and the EU and Australia, New Zealand, and the United States are coordinated more effectively together. That is absolutely essential. And one of the things that Kevin Rudd did in Cannes, I always pronounce that incorrectly, I apologize, 3 years ago, was to put in place an initiative which is designed to improve our overall coordination. But that's not enough. We actually need to be able to be more effectively coordinated within our own government to actually understand what these disparate programs do and what they're responsible for. The fact of the matter is, unlike many places around the world, the Interior Department is responsible for much of what we do in the Pacific, not the Department of State. And so what we've sought to do over the course of the last couple of years is improve our coordination and understanding of what each of our institutions do in the Pacific as a whole. And so we think that there is enormous potential this is not one of those places where there is a substantial gap in resources. In fact, if you look at the collective whole, it is extraordinarily substantial. The challenge is a better degree of coordination, and that coordination has been remarkably difficult, ironically, not only within our government, but with other governments as a whole. But we've seen some progress in the recent period. We've also been struck, frankly, as you travel through the Pacific, there are new indicators of changes in the sort of geopolitical context. In almost every capital, there are large new buildings, many of the and stadiums, many of them built either by China or Taiwan over the course of the last several years. More recently, almost all by China. What's striking is that they not only indicate China's interest in the Pacific, which we support, and we recognize that this is a natural thing, and in fact, we welcome a closer dialogue with China on the Pacific, and we want to work with Chinese friends in this regard. But we have to think carefully about how we use, again, scarce resources. In one or two of the island nations that we went to, we saw magnificent buildings that literally local governments are unable to cool in the summer period or heat when necessary because the electricity costs, energy costs are so high. So what we're seeking is a more comprehensive dialogue with the key donor nations about basically designing approaches that are more relevant and sustainable to given some of the challenges that we're facing in the Pacific as a whole. When we are in Auckland, we will have detailed discussions with virtually every country, including China. We'll have discussions with our friends in Taiwan, with India, with Japan, with virtually every country who have strategic interest in the Pacific as a whole. The other thing that you will see that we think is basically a continuation of the past, but we want to put an exclamation point on it, is there is a recognition that profoundly and deeply this is in Australia and New Zealand's backyard. Australia and New Zealand have been remarkably supportive of us in areas where we have asked for assistance. This is an area in which their knowledge, their proximity mean that they have real powerful national security and national political interests. And so we are seeking to coordinate more closely and frankly to support Australia and New Zealand more on a range of issues through the Pacific. And one of the things that we have sought to do is to take really very clear and demonstrable steps to improve our dialogue and coordination on these matters. For the United States' sake, we give very substantial resources as part of our compacts to a number of islands in the Pacific. And I think one of the most important things in this current budget season and with this very intense scrutiny is we need to ensure that those resources are spent and used wisely. And we are working closely with governments and also with friends in Capitol Hill. Senator Inouye has been an enormous supporter of our approach to the Pacific, but what we have seen in recent years is substantial out-migration from some of these islands to the Hawaiian Islands, and it's put an enormous burden on the infrastructure there, and we need to think carefully about what can be done so that that we can maintain a Pacific in the balance as a whole. I think there's also a recognition that with scarce resources, but the new potential uses of technology, that the Pacific, frankly, is ripe for innovation. One of the most innovative things that we've seen that was implemented by the Coast Guard and come up with by a very junior person is this idea of what is called the shipwriter agreement, which is if a national, law enforcement national from a particular island nation is riding on an American ship, either Coast Guard or Navy, then if we come across an illegal fisherman, then that we will be able to work under a legal framework to take appropriate steps to put in place, legal consequences, fines, and the like. That has enabled us to work much more closely with the range of the island nations to improve our ability to patrol these vast areas of space. We're also working, again, using technology developed elsewhere in the Gulf to improve maritime domain awareness. It is no longer feasible to have large navies in these small island nations. What we need is a much greater sense of where the challenges are so you can vector small numbers of ships and resources to particular places where you think there might be illegal fishing or problems associated with transshipment of people, you name it, some of the things that we see in the Pacific region as a whole. We also want to look very carefully at what I would call targeted initiatives. We've made clear to Chinese friends that we want to highlight areas where the United States and China are seen to be working closely together. We recognize that when we talk about building trust, you have to build it piece by piece together. And so that requires the United States and China to identify clear areas, whether it's energy efficiency or mangrove planting, where our two countries can be seen to work together for a greater good in terms of the well-being of the lives of the people of the Pacific as a whole. We want to take consequential steps over the course of the next few months to demonstrate our desire to secure the Tuna Treaty. The Tuna Treaty has been one of the most important treaties that helps regulate really what is the last healthy pod of tuna in the world, and it is at some risk now. We want to communicate very, very clearly to the signatories the strong American commitment to see that remain in force, and I want it to be clear, and we'll make it clear when we're in Auckland, of our strong determination to take necessary steps, and we want a reciprocal approach from some of the key countries who are involved in this overall effort. There are a number of places as you fly through the Pacific, and I'll just give you this contrast if you wouldn't mind. All of you, or many of you, have been to Europe and have gone to these wonderfully pristine World War II battlefields. These manicured lawns. Remember the opening scene of Saving Private Ryan, just in which everything is perfect. Wonderful marble columns depicting how various columns and pincer movements played out. You fly through the Pacific, and what you are struck with is as if unbelievable carnage and killing. And then when it was done, people got on planes and boats and left. You can find rusted tanks in almost every place where wars were fought during the Second World War. Unexploded ordnance, enormously chilling reminders of war. When we were visiting Tarlow Beach, again, one of the greatest scenes of heroism in our history. To see it, covered in garbage and not tended to in the way, frankly, we should, it was heartbreaking. But at the same time, when we asked our friends, do you ever find unexploded ordnance? I think that was mistaken by our host, can you find us some unexploded ordnance? And within about 5 minutes, they brought shells, and we're like, just put them down, we'll move away. But we have found some resources. We want to work with our friends in the Pacific and other countries to put back in place some unexploded ordnance initiatives. That will assist every year. There are tragedies associated with this, and we think this is an important legacy issue that the United States has to be engaged with. We're looking closely at the Peace Corps. The Peace Corps has substantially downgraded its capabilities and its resources in the Pacific, but we think we have some opportunities here. Every place we go, every place we went in the Pacific, the leaders of every one of these island nations would say, first of all, cannot tell how much we appreciate the Peace Corps for those countries that still had programs. And for those countries that no longer had them, the first question was, is there anything that we can do to get them back? Clearly, intensity of storms due to climate change and other things are picking up. We need to work more closely with a variety of countries on disaster relief, not just what we do once they happen, but preparing in advance. This will be a subject of some of our discussions in Auckland over the course of the next couple of days, and also obviously taking whatever steps possible to deal with this remarkable set of challenges associated with energy. Again, more sunlight than basically anywhere else on the planet, less use of renewable energy than almost any other place on the planet. So the challenges are stark, they are troublesome. But we believe fundamentally that a continued effort on the part of the United States, working closely with friends and others who share an interest in the Pacific, that we can make a difference. The key here also, and I'd like to conclude with this, is that, look, we are in a very difficult period domestically, lots of fighting about a lot of issues, but one of the things that we can be grateful for over a period of decades is that we've had a relative commitment to bipartisanship in terms of what we've done in Asia and the Pacific. I'm joined here by a very dear friend, Torkel Patterson. When he was in government, there was nothing more I like to do than to support him. Same with Mike Green. What we need to do is to sustain that overall commitment to, so no matter who the baton is handed to in the future, that there is a recognition that these issues are profoundly, deeply in the national security, political, moral, and strategic interests of the United States. I recognize that I've skipped over a lot of things, but I want to leave time for questions. Thank you all for coming, and I'll look forward to reporting back through Ernie and others what we accomplished when we're out in Auckland. I think I'll take my questions from there if that's all. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Kurt. Thank you very much, Kurt. Really appreciate that tour of U.S. strategy in the Pacific. Appreciate your taking some questions. Let me just remind everyone, we welcome your questions, but please identify yourself and your affiliation when you do so. I think I'll stand up so I don't leave these guys out. First question right here for the gentleman.
Thank you. Campbell from China News Service. Speaking of China, China has launched a white paper on its peaceful development plan, saying that it will never seek hegemony, but will firmly safeguard its national core interests. So, any comments on the white paper and the views in it?
I didn't understand completely the question.
China has, issued a white paper on its peaceful development plan, saying that it will never seek hegemony, but will firmly safeguard its national core interests. So I wonder whether you have any comments.
I haven't had a chance yet. I look forward to reading the white paper actually on the long flights over. I will say, generally speaking, that I think that our administration, previous administrations have made very clear that it is in the strategic interest of both of our countries to maintain strong, healthy relations. We want to see a China that plays a strong, positive role in global politics. I think we welcome deeper engagement on a range of issues, political, security, economic as a whole. I think it is also the case that particularly with respect to security issues, we seek to step up the dialogue between our two sides, and also we believe that a degree of transparency is a healthy thing in terms of reassuring and communicating clearly intentions and aspirations. But overall, I think we're pleased with the progress in U.S.-China relations, and we welcome the publication of this document.
Let me go over here to Stanley Roth.
Stanley Roth, you didn't mention, I don't think, France in your presentation.
Yeah.
Continued colonial presence in Polynesia and New Caledonia an issue in terms of how the other islands view U.S. policy?
Thank you, Stanley, and I appreciate very much the question and the reference. In almost every place that that I've gone in the Pacific, the issue of the colonial role of not France but other countries does come up. We've had good discussions with French friends about various aspects of our engagement in the Pacific. I think these issues are less complicated now because of the different set of priorities taken by a succession of French governments on nuclear matters. And we look forward to consultations with them, for instance, when we sit down over the course of the next couple of days in Auckland.
In the back, gentleman here.
Riley, SAIS, and the Australian National University. Thank you, Kurt. I think this is a very welcome development, and thanks to CSIS as well for their related focus on the Pacific, which is well overdue. My question is, how realistic is the idea of development cooperation with nations like China, amongst others, given that, as you alluded to, a lot of the Chinese aid in the Pacific is really not developmental in nature. It's prestige projects, and it has a strategic dimension. Of course, the competition with Taiwan is another big issue. So, you know, the idea that you will cooperate with China sounds terrific. There's also the basic problem that for a lot of Pacific governments, having a range of donors competing with each other has been very useful over the years because they've got a lot of money out of it. So could you address that issue?
Well, first of all, thank you very much for the question. Let me say that if you look at almost every area of success in which the international community has been consequentially engaged in either a development or an assistance project, you see a high degree of coordination and integration. That coordination and integration is generally absent in the Pacific. And so I believe that ultimately it is in the best interest of the Pacific peoples, of their governments, and of the donors as a whole to work more comprehensively together on sector approaches, on looking carefully at what's worked and what has not worked, and also a recognition that, you know, prestige projects and the like only go so far. There are a number of areas where the United States and China have been able to work together in Southeast Asia and elsewhere. And I have high confidence that if we take this in a sustained and committed way, that working, and it won't be just with China, it will be with Japan, with South Korea, that we will be able to find areas that we can work together and that we can demonstrate success. And I believe at a fundamental level that there is much basis for coordination, and I don't believe that there is that much, frankly, to compete over overall. There are a few islands that have some substantial resources, but basically what you have in the Pacific is a series of very difficult, intractable problems that sometimes newcomers to the region find out sooner or later. So it's up to us to see how we can work together to bring, again, limited resources in a way that are designed for the betterment of the people. And frankly, there is a lot of waste and there is a lot of misuse that with a more effective approach, I think that we can at least improve.
Thank you. John Zhang with CTI TV of Taiwan. Mr. Secretary, I have an issue you may find very hard to work with China. Could you update us on the deliberation or decision on F-16 sales to Taiwan? The clock is clicking, and the deadline, October 1st deadline set by Secretary Clinton, is fast approaching. Thank you.
Thank you for your question. I think, as you well know, and you probably can repeat my line directly back to me, the United States has a national interest in maintaining peace and stability across the Taiwan Strait. We take those interests very seriously. We are committed to Taiwan's defense, and we support the Taiwan Relations Act. And we, frankly, have been very pleased by the positive developments that we've seen over the course of the last few years across the Taiwan Strait. We'd like that to continue. On specifics, I'm afraid I can't provide anything further, but thanks for the question.
Mr. Secretary, thank you from Voice of America. About the democratization process in the Asia-Pacific region, we heard that U.S. Special Envoy Mr. Derek Mitchell is on the way to Burma. And do you expect that it can deliver the message to the Burmese government to better tie with the United States? How do you assess the development inside Burma that you visited last year?
First of all, thank you very much again for the question. It's a little further afield from the Pacific, but I'll take this on. First of all, very grateful that Derek Mitchell has the chance to travel. This is his first visit as our special envoy for Burma. We're looking forward to his deliberations inside country, and frankly, I'm just as anxious as you are to see what his reports are as he emerges from his meetings. I believe he'll be having consequential interactions with both members of the government and also Aung San Suu Kyi, and also representatives from the ethnic groups. I don't think I'd like to characterize any further. I'd like to, frankly, hear what Derek has to say. I will say that we have seen some steps in the last few days that we intend to explore.
Thank you, Secretary. Tiger Jung from the Stimson Center. I have two short questions. First one is what do you see the strategic relationship between the systematic re-engagement with the Pacific and the U.S. re-engagement with Southeast Asia in terms of the U.S. general policy towards Asia? And the second question is, given the budget cut and bipolar fight in the Congress, what kind of hurdles or struggles do you expect in their support for future programs, especially USAID? Thank you.
Thank you very much. Excellent questions. I would say one of the things that I am finding as I consult and talk with friends on Capitol Hill and also allies is I think there is a welcome recognition that our future and frankly much of the history of the 21st century is going to be written in the Asian Pacific region, and the United States has an incredibly important role to play in that. And I think one of the great challenges of American foreign policy and national security is how we carefully and responsibly rebalance. Tom Donilon, our national security advisor, has talked about rebalancing. We have enduring security interests, political interests in Europe, and particularly the Middle East. But clearly, we will need a deeper, more sustained engagement, not just bilaterally, not just with new friends like Indonesia, in India, a strong dialogue with China, but one of the things that we have not talked about, which is really a commitment to institutions in Asia and Pacific. That's the reason that we talked about the Pacific Island Forum in November, and I expect Ernie and CSIS will have a session about this later. The United States, as you know, will be joining the East Asia Summit for the first time. We will be holding another of our series of U.S.-ASEAN summits. This will be our third in the last few years. There are a number of consequential steps that we want to take within these multilateral frameworks with the recognition that if Asia is to play its role, it needs stronger institutions with deeper roots. And the United States wants to support that and see what's possible over the course of the next few years, with the recognition that this process will take a substantial period of time. But just to conclude where you began, I believe that there will be a strong bipartisan commitment to a stronger U.S. presence in the Asian Pacific region, and I am quite I believe in that, and I'm intent on seeing that come to pass. Two more. Two.
Being with Phoenix TV.
Hi.
My question is, it was reported U.S., India, and Japan are going to have a trilateral meeting next month, and you will be the leader of the delegation for the U.S. Could you please confirm this report, and what is your assessment, and how significant is the trilateral relation among U.S., Japan, and India?
Well, let me just answer the question more generally. So I would say that obviously at the heart of our relationship are our bilateral security ties, and we have sought to follow on the strong work that President Bush, presidents before him have done to keep those relationships the center, the core of what we've sought to do. In addition, as I indicated, these more formal multilateral engagements, recharging APEC, the East Asia Summit, extraordinarily important. One of the other things that, again, we've seen over the course of the last few years is the rise of what one might describe as minilateralism, smaller ad hoc groupings of nations that are designed to tackle particular problems or to increase dialogue or consultation. So, for instance, when we were in Bali, we had a very consequential meeting between the United States, Japan, and South Korea. We want to actually establish a secretariat that will help support the recurring preparation for those sessions, and we've sought other sorts of trilateral engagements and other larger scale efforts. It is our larger goal to do what we can to draw India more into the Asia-Pacific region, to get them to have successful engagements in multilateral fora, to play an important role in the trade, strategic, economic interactions in the region as a whole, and to work more closely in the diplomatic context. I'm not going to comment directly about the specifics, but we have said that we want to improve coordination between Japan, the United States, and India. I will conclude by saying on this issue that we have had very detailed discussions with Chinese friends about their involvement in a number of these institutions, and we've given them a number of proposals. We'd like very much for Chinese friends to engage in some of these settings because we think that they will help build trust and confidence. We think that they will help us to tackle common problems, transnational challenges and the like, and we think that they send an important message of reassurance in a region that is looking to see that the United States and China understand our responsibilities in terms of demonstrating an ability to work together on important problems. Take one last question.
Thank you, Secretary. I'm Jeannie Nguyen with Voice of Vietnamese Americans.
Hi.
Would you comment about the current posture of China in the South China Sea? How would that affect your initiative in the Pacific? Thank you.
Yeah, let me just at a general level, the way the United States thinks about maritime related issues is obviously freedom of navigations, freedom of the seas, maintenance of peace and stability. These are all enduring core values in terms of how the United States sees our role as a whole. I think we were pleased at the first step that was taken in advance of the ASEAN Regional Forum in terms of the understanding that was reached between ASEAN and China. I think Secretary Clinton said it's a first step, but only a first step. We'd like to see some consequential diplomacy that will follow on from that, hopefully improve trust and confidence in the South China Sea. There's a recognition that these issues must be handled carefully, and that by some measures, a third of global commerce passes through the South China Sea. This is already an issue of deep international concern, and we want all issues to be handled with a cool head and a strong strategic sense. Okay.
Thank you very much, Kurt. Before I close, let me remind you, and I guess this backs up Kurt's assertion, that on Friday, September 9th, we'll be hosting the U.S. Armed Services Ranking Member Adam Smith of Washington State, Congressman Adam Smith, for a policy address entitled America's Commitment to Asia, and he's going to be talking about how Congress views the role of our armed services in the region and that shifting of balance that you talked about, Kurt. So I hope you'll all join us on Friday at 9 a.m.
Can we thank Ernie also for the great work that he and CSIS has done, if we could?
Well, I want to ask you to join me in thanking Kurt Campbell for his great leadership. Thank you, Kurt. Appreciate it.